Hi, and welcome back to Neon Liberalism, a weekly podcast where we try to take the issues of the day and put them in a larger historical and theoretical context. And in case you are living in um, a cave that has not recently been exploded, I'm going to tell you that there's recently been an American attack on Iran, a very large Israeli attack on Iran, both with the intention of disrupting Iran's nuclear program, a program that they've been pursuing for some time, most people assume, in order to develop nuclear weapons. And for most of my life, nuclear war seemed like it was basically off the table, right? The Cold War had ended, the great risk of mutually assured destruction was over. You didn't really need to think about nuclear weapons anymore, except maybe in the context of we should get rid of some of them. We've exited that era, I think, very decisively at this point. We are entering a new era of great power or national competition. And in many cases, that competition seems to involve or implicate, in some ways, nuclear weapons. So I wanted to talk about that, about what nuclear weapons are and what they can do for you and what they can't do for you as a country. And so I thought I would have on the podcast a returning guest, Matthew Downhour. He's written several pieces for us about foreign policy and especially about this new era of nuclear threats. So yeah, Matthew, thanks so much for coming back on.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. It's funny that you mentioned, in your lifetime, nuclear war has seemed like not a possible thing, because I think that one of the very first, I think we're about the same age, one of the very first news stories I remember seeing on TV, which you may remember, was Operation Desert Fox, that sort of couple-day bombing of Iraq. So regarding their nuclear weapons program, ostensibly in 1998. So I think as long as I've been alive, two things have been true. Nuclear war has seemed impossible. On the other hand, nuclear non-proliferation, or the control of nuclear weapons, has been perhaps the most common reason given for foreign intervention. It's been like sort of the maybe consistent focus of U.S. foreign policy, at least rhetorically. Not, of course, 2003 with Iraq being the biggest case, but it's come up pretty repeatedly, and it's been sort of this constant in the background, like, what if another country got nuclear weapons? And so we've had this weird dichotomy where nuclear war is unthinkable. At the same time, a lot of conventional wars apparently, are started on the basis of we need to keep anybody else from having these weapons.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's a lot more foreign interventions than just American interventions, but you're right that American policy for decades, I mean, well before the end of the Cold War, was about nonproliferation. Was about this idea that we really needed to keep other countries from getting nuclear weapons. And so to kind of understand the context of all this and what's going on with nuclear weapons as a weapon, I want to start by doing a little historical detour and talking about how people first thought about nuclear weapons. Um, and especially the policy that 1945, the United States uses two nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within a few years, the Soviets also get the bomb. They had a lot of spies in the Manhattan Project, but they would have gotten it even without that. The genie was out of the bottle in terms of nuclear weapons. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how war planners initially thought about nuclear weapons in warfare.
Sure, and yeah, really, war planners had a lot of sort of odd ideas, we would say now, about nuclear weapons, right? But interesting is you could argue that the idea of nuclear deterrence almost precedes the idea of nuclear weapons, right? Like the Einstein-Shillard letter in 1939, where the physicists tell Roosevelt, like, hey, we think that Hitler could be onto this, or at least this is a theoretical possibility. We should get it first. I mean, that was 6 years before anyone had tested a weapon. So one of the theories has always been deterrence, right? That nuclear weapons will be so powerful that as long as two parties have them, they'll be essentially off the table, right? That no one would want to initiate that. That's the mutually assured destruction sort of model. But that hasn't always, there's been that. And then at the same time, there's been preparation for this contingency that, like, but what if that doesn't work, right? is there a possibility around nuclear assured destruction? And so, through the 50s and maybe into the early 60s, there was a lot of thought that went into like, well, we only have so many weapons, and the other side only has so many weapons. Could it be possible that we disable their capacity, that someone could actually win a nuclear war, right? Or I guess the bigger concern is, could we lose a nuclear war? Is there a missile gap with the Soviet Union? Is there a supersonic jet gap with the Soviet Union? Uh, that means that they could strike us and we wouldn't be able to complete our half of the assured destruction, so to speak. Um, that that with the two powers, I think that sort of led to this idea of the nuclear triad, right? That you want to have your land-based silos, your nuclear submarines that no one knows where they are, and your air force capable of launching nuclear weapons as well. And between those three things, even if you're hit first, you're going to have the capacity to deliver a devastating blowback. Um, and that doesn't do you any good, but having the capacity to do it is what's supposed to help you out there. What's interesting is that there's also then sort of under a different undercurrent of these smaller countries that don't have necessarily the same mutually assured destruction role, right? But instead want their own individual deterrent. France probably being the most famous of these because of de Gaulle and his insistence that France does not want to rely on a U.S. or NATO nuclear umbrella. That being a great power actually means having this capacity for oneself. And that strategy and thinking is quite a bit different. It's more national than global. But it turns out that's probably what's most relevant to the discussions of nuclear weapons and how they're being used or leveraged today.
Yeah, so I think that there's the mad side, the mutually assured destruction side, which has its own logic to it, right? That once you have enough nuclear warheads to hit every city in the other country, a dozen times over, you can say, look, don't do this or we're going to blow you up. But they can say the same thing. And then you get into this worry. Well, what if they do a first strike against our nuclear capacities, what's sometimes called a counterforce attack, right? Where you throw a bunch of nuclear weapons at the air bases and at the submarines and at the everything, and then we'll be out of nuclear weapons, and they'll still have nuclear weapons, and we'll be totally at their mercy. And so there's this continuing escalation where you need to have a triad, you need to have a bigger triad, a stealthier triad, you need to have more warheads to ensure that that enough of them are going to survive. Right, this is the assured part of mutually assured destruction, and it leads to this arms race in nuclear weapons that leads to, at the height of the Cold War, both nations having tens of thousands of extremely powerful nuclear warheads. Um, so that's the story about nuclear power that I think most people are most familiar with. Um, I'm also really interested in what we had before MAD. Um, that before we achieved stockpiles of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and before we had a complete nuclear triad and a continuous at-sea deterrent and all that, war planners like Eisenhower, like especially as president, had a different idea about what nuclear weapons could do for them. Um, and so Eisenhower era defense policy is driven by this idea that we want to wind down the mass mobilization of World War II, but we can't leave ourselves exposed to the Red Army, which is still enormous and still out there. So what we're going to do is have nuclear weapons instead, right? And this is a fundamental part of what Eisenhower calls the New Look policy.
And bang for your buck, right? That's the phrase. The nuclear weapon gives you more bang for your buck. They're expensive, but not nearly as expensive as the equivalent firepower in conventional weapons, especially to maintain.
Yes, exactly. So Eisenhower was big on, like New Look in general was big on this idea of cost savings, that we're going to have a very small conventional force, but we'll have a huge nuclear force. Not huge, but a large enough nuclear force, and that the strategic doctrine is what they call massive retaliation. That, okay, you attack us and we will wipe you off the map. Or in some cases, the idea is, well, it's not even if you attack us, but what if we want to achieve an outcome in a diplomacy, then we can threaten you. We can threaten you with massive retaliation if you're doing something that we don't like. Um, and excuse me. Right, and so this is a way, an idea of leveraging nuclear power to achieve certain kinds of geopolitical outcomes instead of using traditional conventional power to do the same thing. Um, and how does that work out in practice?
Right. Well, I was gonna as you're describing that, right? In some ways, the theory there being right, there's no way the U.S. could mobilize and ship and support an army in Europe the size of the Soviet army in Europe. Right. The logistics were too difficult. Europe was too devastated and maybe not totally on board with this Cold War. And so massive retaliation is kind of the substitute to that. Uh, the closest analogy, really, I feel like to that is India Pakistan, where Pakistan, that is basically their. They also have sort of a massive retaliation doctrine, right? You saw this with the um, the recent conflicts there. India is more or less a no first strike state, meaning they've said their doctrine, with some exceptions, they will not use nuclear weapons first. They're a deterrent. Pakistan is not, and for exactly the same reason that the U.S. was not. It's not practical for them to maintain a standing army, a conventional army that is guaranteed to be able to defeat or India or defend their territory. So, in the event of an extended conflict with India, they're open to using nuclear weapons to defend their territory if that is threatened. And we saw that more or less implied during the last conflict, right? When they called together their Security Council that can authorize that use, that's a message to the world, right? To India, but also to potential mediating powers. Like, we're starting to get serious about this, and it's time for this to cool down before we enter into, the zone where something big could be possible. And that's not terribly unlike U.S. policy towards Berlin, for example, in the 50s. Like, if you cross the border and you start this war, who knows what could happen? But certainly nuclear weapons are on the table, and the threat is there to keep the diplomacy moving in our direction.
Yeah, I think the India Pakistan example is interesting because they very much did have a shooting conflict, right? Where missiles and bombs went across the border in both directions, planes were shot down, people were killed. There was a conventional conflict that occurred despite both powers being nuclear powers and being very large, or large enough nuclear
Mm-hmm.
powers. Um, and this is basically what happens with Eisenhower or with a new look policy. Um, right? There's this idea that we can downscale and we don't need the conventional forces, and like nuclear weapons will do what we needed to, both in terms of defending ourselves and in terms of leverage. And then we promptly get into a war in Vietnam, right? Where the whole idea of massive retaliation just doesn't seem to work. Um,
Right.
right? We are not able to coherently threaten the with North Vietnam. We do, in fact, wind up relying on quite large conventional forces. This is a little bit pre-Eisenhower, but you can see the same thing happening in Korea. Um,
Well,
right.
I was just saying, this is the second time it happens in Vietnam, right? France develops nuclear weapons before they withdraw from Vietnam. I think only slightly before, but before they withdraw from Vietnam. But it is this sort of conflict, right, that it is not amenable to using nuclear weapons. And so, despite this immense power that they've built up, they also withdraw from Vietnam in the 50s. And we find ourselves in much the same situation, right? This kind of war, this kind of technology does not guarantee that you win, or even necessarily contribute to a meaningful victory.
Okay. And why is that? Right. Like, both like France had nuclear weapons, the United States had nuclear weapons, but the threat of them was not, or the possibility of the threat of them was not enough to win this war or to compel the outcome that we wanted. Why is that?
It's an interesting question, right? I think um, uh, in the end, it comes down to you can maybe read it one of two ways. One is that global opinion is so important that and nuclear weapons such an enormous breach of that using it in essentially a colonial conflict or one of these proxy wars it isn't worth it. You'd rather withdraw than sort of take the shame of having used the nuclear weapons and the international sanction that comes along with it. The other possibility, but more cynically, is that uh, you know it doesn't work. Nuclear weapons are to level cities. They're to level industrial capacity. Um, sure, you could. I mean, in a colonial war, that's you. You are the cities. You own right. Generally, what you control are the cities. For the U.S., I mean, I think people tossed around this idea of like Nuke Hanoi, um, but the understanding was the situation would become far, far worse. It would have brought China deeper into it because of and lost any allies the U.S. had, and likely would not have solved our fundamental problem, which is that we also didn't really have the support of the South Vietnamese population on anything like the level needed to continue supporting operations. So those are probably maybe the two explanations that I can come up with as far as why nuclear weapons did not have this impact that was broadly feared. George Orwell's essay, like "You and the Bomb," uh, he assumes that the countries that develop these weapons will basically just be able to walk all over everyone else because they're so powerful. It didn't turn out quite exactly like that.
Yeah, and I think that's important, right? For Orwell, for Eisenhower, for the early series of war planners, they had lived through two world wars. They had lived through World War II, where cities were leveled not with atomic weaponry, but with conventional weaponry. Right, that was the kind of war that they assumed that they would be fighting in the future, a absolutely total war, in which, yes, of course, we are going to be leveling cities. Whether we do that with conventional explosives, or we do that by hand, or we do that with a nuclear weapon, these are wars of like absolute conflict. Um, but then norms change, right? The perception of the world changes. No one wants to be going around leveling cities in the way that they were leveled, en masse in World War II.
And the change is asymmetrical, right? Uh, for Ho Chi Minh and for Giap and the North Vietnamese, it was a total war. Like this was everything, right? This was their country that they were not willing to lose. For France and later for the U.S., this was like mostly a political issue, right? And so the extent of the, I mean, obviously Ho Chi Minh didn't have the capacity to level Los Angeles, but I think from his perspective, it would have absolutely been justified, right, for his country to be independent. It was not there was not the same level of importance placed on it for the U.S. or France, and for that reason, you know, it did not become a absolutely total war like World War II, or at least there was pressure against it becoming that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this is something that I really want to dwell on is how nuclear threats turn out to be quite dependent on, and the effectiveness of nuclear threats turns out to be quite dependent on this kind of perception, this kind of cultural question of like what's important and what isn't, and what's worth using a nuclear weapon for and what isn't. And one way to kind of get into that um, is to talk a little bit about the theory of why nuclear weapons didn't end war and didn't end conflict. And this is sometimes called salami tactics, um, where the idea of salami tactics is you have a big hunk of salami, and if you grab the whole salami, someone's going to object, right? They're going to say, "You can't take my salami. I have a nuclear weapon. I will kill you with it." But what if you just shave off a little piece of salami? Are they willing to go to nuclear war over a single piece of salami? Maybe not. Take another slice of salami, another slice of salami. Right, and it's this idea that, like, okay, there are certain actions we can take that are very large, very escalatory. Those will lead to nuclear war, and those are off the table. But then there's all these smaller actions we can take, right? Conventional actions, guerrilla warfare, they call it gray zone warfare these days, right? The fait accompli, where fait accompli, with sorry, where yeah, what if we can just seize the whole thing all at once? And like it's not a protracted war anymore. We just have whatever it is that we want, and then like, are you really going to go to war, to nuclear war, to try and take it back? And this, is kind of what permits all of the proxy wars, the guerrilla wars, all the conflicts of the Cold War that don't escalate to nuclear war.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the over some objections, right? MacArthur being the most prominent, like that if you let this happen, right, or if you let yourself lose a small war, you lose your credibility on the big things. And that's always the balance. You don't actually want to use your nuclear weapons, but you need to, like you said, you need to maintain a credible threat. Otherwise, the salami tactic works, right? Take a bit, a bit, a bit, a bit, a bit. And that is a very difficult balance, I think, for nuclear powers to strike effectively.
Yeah, I think MacArthur is an interesting person to mention here because the Soviets very much do get involved in Korea, right? They are supplying airframes, they're supplying MiGs. I think it's at this point it's pretty well known that they are flying
Right,
MiGs
they
and
are the
putting
actual
into
pilots. We never
yes,
catch one, right? But we know that they're flying some of the planes. Yeah,
right. The Americans and Soviets are dogfighting over Korea. They are killing each other over Korea. Right, that this level of conflict between two nuclear powers is possible. Right, the same thing happens again in Vietnam, although in that case it's more a matter of them providing SAMs and SAM operators. But again, it's Soviets killing Americans and Americans killing Soviets. But it's all, so far into the gray zone that it doesn't lead to nuclear war. These are kinds of conflicts where conflict is still possible despite nuclear weapons, right? And where conventional arms are, you can't be substituted away for nuclear weapons, which I think is important to understanding the context we find ourselves in now. Um, and what you might call the problem of red lines.
yes, uh, yes. I don't know who invented this red line idea. I first remember it applied to Syria with chemical weapons, right? So red line, no chemical weapons. What if there's like a little bit of chemical weapons? Well, now we look silly because we're not actually ready to go to war with Syria over a little bit of chemical weapons, uh, or even a fairly large scale deployment of chemical weapons if it doesn't if we don't have the world behind us on it. And so then you have this red line and you let it get crossed, and then at that point, we've lost any credibility to enforce really anything. Uh, and that is the problem with red lines: is that if you draw them without being in a position to actually enforce them, you lose that. The color red loses any of its enforcement capacity.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the case of Obama in Syria, I always felt was like a kind of huge foreign policy misstep, right? Where he issues this very, very explicit, very clear threat, calls it a red line, and then as it transpires, he's not willing to enforce it.
Right.
Right? Because fundamentally, like the issue here, he wasn't threatening nuclear war, he was just threatening conventional war. But the problem with threats is that words are cheap. Words are really cheap, right? You can say anything, you can issue any kind of threat you want. What makes it work is if that threat is credible, right? If
Right.
people believe that you're actually willing to follow through. And in many cases, the way to be credible is to be willing and able to follow through.
Right.
But but when it comes to convention, like that's tough enough when we're talking about a conventional war. If you're talking about a nuclear war and you're issuing nuclear threats, the difficulty of credibility is so much higher because it opens up such unbelievable risks for your country to start throwing around nuclear weapons because somebody might start throwing them back.
Right. Right, and that's where, like I said, with the case of Pakistan, they have a pretty well understood like escalatory ladder, right? We call together our council. That means it's serious. That doesn't mean we're going to utilize nuclear weapons, but the world understands like what that means, right? I believe in the '90s they even intentionally were moving logistics around in a way that they knew would be satellite visible, so that the U.S. would know, like, no, this is serious. It's not a irrevocable step to war, but it telegraphs this is a serious. It isn't just talk, right? Um, the totally reverse of that is Russia, which has a very interesting strategy where Dmitry Medvedev just goes ranting about how they're definitely going to use nuclear weapons, but he's not actually the one who makes the call. And then Putin on the other side of things is much more uh, still ominous, but much calmer about and much more, at least publicly facing, much more rational about what Russia is actually likely to do, uh, which creates this weird ambiguity where there is no legible to us escalation ladder, right? We have really no idea what the truth is about how they're thinking about things internally. Uh, but that serves their purposes, just where Pakistan's very clear ladder serves theirs.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, right? That there are kind of two ways people have tried to navigate these issues, right? And one of them, like you described, is strategic ambiguity, where you don't really want people to know exactly where your red lines are. And like you like this because like you think it creates the perception of threat and people alter their behavior around it. And the other answer, like you say, is to have very clear escalation ladder, very clear red lines. Um, this is kind of the approach, suggested by the French theorist Andre Beaufre, where he says, like, to make it all work, to make your threats credible, you need to have a story, and the story needs to be coherent, right? And when you make moves diplomatically, when you issue threats, they should all cohere, right? And something that's a false note, that is, in other words, bullshit, right, is going to undermine your whole story about where your red lines are, and in so doing is going to undermine the strategic effectiveness of your nuclear weapons, right? Because they are strategically effective when people believe that you might use them in such and such circumstances, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. And if they stop believing it, then your nuclear weapons stop being so useful.
Right, right, and that seems to be is that for at least a smaller country where the nuclear weapons really are a deterrent to something that they can't deter conventionally. That seems to be the prominent way of thinking on it, right? You want to communicate clearly, not overdo the red lines, right? Because your credibility is the only thing keeping you safe. On the other hand, Russia has a lot of other steps to take, and so for them, the credibility is not so important, right? They want people to be afraid of their use of nuclear weapons, but really, it's not a matter of probably of national survival like it is for like it might become for a smaller country, right? Russia also has an enormous conventional military. They're also just huge, and they have a lot of other resources to draw on there.
Yeah, and so this brings me to this idea. Like a lot of people have the idea that nuclear weapons, like the only real red lines, are a conventional attack on your country, right? And anything else diplomatically, well, like why would you respond with nuclear weapons to something that's not an attack on you personally? But like this isn't accurate. Like you can look at both what has actually happened and how nuclear weapons have shaped policy, and that's not where the red line is, right? It's the red line isn't actually at the borders of your country. Um, and you can see this in, I think, two places where it's very obvious. One of them is the American red line, which we put right at the outer edge of NATO, right? We put the red line right along, the east-west German border, but that's not America. West
Indeed.
Germany had no nuclear weapons, um, but we had a story, right? We had a well-maintained commitment to NATO, to the territorial integrity of NATO, to Article 5, the mutual defense aspects of NATO that we kind of committed to over and over. And quite evidently, the Soviets believed that they could not seize West Germany the way that they seized Czechoslovakia.
And
Um,
notably, to some extent, right, the point of that expanding that envelope there, that red line, is so that Italy doesn't feel like it needs to get its own nuclear weapons. Germany doesn't feel like it needs to get its own nuclear weapons because they feel like they're behind this red line, right?
that's right.
As I recall, South Korea had a nuclear weapons program in the Cold War that we sort of asked them to discontinue, and they did because there was really no need so long as there were U.S. soldiers in South Korea. There was a conventional offer of protection and the understanding, I assume, that a nuclear first strike on South Korea would be responded to by the U.S., although even if it wasn't necessarily put in writing like NATO was.
Yeah, that's right. That this is in many ways a key part of the non-proliferation regime, right? That there were many countries that could have gotten nuclear weapons, right? They had the science, they had the industry, they could have done it, but they didn't because they felt protected. Um, And I think the other half of the point I was trying to make is that Ukraine invaded Russia. Not to start with, but like as part of the war, Ukraine made a major incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. They crossed the national boundary, and Russia didn't nuke them back, right? Russia did not deploy nuclear weapons to defend its territorial integrity because that's not actually where the red line is.
Right, and it wasn't necessary for them to do so. Right, they had the conventional power to eventually
Hmm.
reclaim that territory, and it's still it's important for them that there be a red line somewhere back behind that, particularly a red line aimed not so much at Ukraine, but a red line aimed at the U.S. or at the EU. Um, and yeah, once you there's only so many escalatory steps above the nuclear weapons, right? Even a so-called tactical use of them, really, no one knows what happens next because it's never happened. There's no precedent there.
There's no precedent there. The great fear has always been that you can't stop it, right? Once you uncork that bottle and you say, "Oh, it's just a tactical nuclear weapon," the other side's going to say, "I don't care,"
Right,
right? Like you're using nukes, we're using nukes,
right,
right? We're going to throw them a little bit farther, right? Like, there's, especially in the context of modern war, it's not like the front line is somewhere where like that's like really identifiable and totally separate from civilian targets, like a tac nuke, and you're throwing it at somebody's supply depot 100 miles behind the line that's just in a city,
right.
right?
Well, I mean, as we saw with India, Pakistan, I don't believe any soldiers ever crossed the border, and if they did, it was minor, and yet hundreds of people died. Right. In the first strikes, even the planes didn't cross the border. Right. Entirely
Mhm.
standoff munitions created a lot of casualties, right? So this idea of a border that's going to protect you, right, or like that crossing the border is the red line, becomes much more difficult to maintain when crossing the border isn't really even necessary to inflict a lot of damage, as we've seen with Iran and Israel, who don't even have a border, and yet are able to maintain 12 days of pretty intensive bombardment of each other.
Yeah. So that's definitely what I want to try and turn to right now is like, how does the stuff that we're talking about, that we have talked about in terms of nuclear theory, like, how does that help us understand what has been happening in Iran, and in Israel?
Sure. I mean, I think, well, when you look at Israel, this is a long-standing policy on their part, going back at least to 1980 with Iraq, right? That countries hostile to Israel in the region should not have nuclear weapons, right? And this comes down to even more so than India, Pakistan. Israel is not very big. They have an extremely powerful conventional military, but they don't have, and this has always sort of shaped their strategic doctrine. They don't have territory to trade, right? In the early days of Russia invading Ukraine, you heard a lot this idea of trading land for time, and they did that with great effect, right? Russians have to drive across 100 miles of mud, and in that time, Ukraine can develop a real defense. Israel's never had that capacity, right? And so this puts them in a much more, I would say, aggressive posture towards their neighbors because they don't have a lot of room for error. Um, and they don't have, I mean, they're not signed on to the Non Proliferation Treaty. They're not signed on to kind of a lot of these other frameworks that govern various other countries' kind of interactions with nuclear weapons. So they maintain strategic ambiguity, although pretty much everyone now knows they have nuclear weapons. They don't say that they do, right? They don't have like anything like a transparent nuclear posture. Um, and when they felt like Iraq may have developed nuclear weapons in 1980, they didn't really wait for anybody. They went and they destroyed I believe it was 1980. They destroyed the site. Sometime in the early 80s, anyway. Uh, Iran was long thought to be sort of logistically beyond their capacity to do that, but it turns out they were quite effective. Perhaps not at ending the nuclear program, but at delivering quite a blow to Iran's military infrastructure generally. But this has basically been their posture: is like, we don't have a lot of room for error, and so we can't let any country hostile and close to us uh, acquire this kind of technology, acquire this kind of armament.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it's worth emphasizing, like you said, that Israel has a very powerful conventional military, and that they've always maintained that, despite being a nuclear power for more than half, I believe at this point, more than half a century. Right. And
Right.
again, they don't talk about it, but most people think they have a pretty substantial nuclear arsenal. Right. If they wanted to turn, and they have the delivery, like quite obviously at this point, they have the delivery systems. Right. If they wanted to turn one of their neighbors into glass, they could do it. But they did not feel that that capacity by itself was enough to guarantee their security. Right.
Right. Right. And so they have, yes. And so they sort of keep multiple levels of escalation available to them, right? Probably Iran was pushing the limits of their capacity, but for example, Syria is not. Right? They even with the Assad regime, they kept sort of an understanding that we're going to periodically bomb your sites or bomb sites in your country that we don't want to be there, but we could do so much worse to you, and that leaves to some extent like how the U.S. treated Iran, right? We'll bomb your sites, but we'll do much worse if you retaliate against anything besides a base in Qatar that we probably know is going to be attacked. Um, and that I think does show to some extent, diplomatically speaking or geopolitically speaking, the value of having this conventional superiority regardless of your nuclear superiority, right? That there are so many more things that you can do with the conventional military that aren't really, Eisenhower was wrong. They're not really replaceable, right, by nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are maybe seen as there's nothing that can replace them either, right? There's nothing quite like that capacity.
So that's actually my question here. Right, we've seen Israel has total conventional military superiority over its neighbors. I think at this point, again, we can say pretty clear conventional military superiority over Iran. They have their own they have their own assured destruction nuclear capacity. And even still, they're very concerned about Iran getting the bomb. Um, why is that? Right? If nobody uses nuclear weapons and you have a conventional superiority, like why is there still the fear of Iran getting the bomb?
Sure, and I think to some extent we can see, right, with India Pakistan, that is the scenario Israel does not want. They don't want a scenario where their conventional military is winning, and probably India was winning that, although who knows, there's a big fog of war around that conflict. But they don't want a scenario where they have the conventional upper hand and then they're forced to back down because Iran starts to telegraph, nope, this is getting serious, and a first strike is possible. My guess would be that's what they're looking to avoid, right? This is why it was important in the early 90s for Russia that Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus not have nuclear weapons, right? Not because they posed a real threat conventionally, not because Russia had any lack of conventional dominance over those countries, but because there was that sort of sticking point, right? That the conventional dominance can only be pushed so far if we're talking about a situation where both countries have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. Right, that if you have conventional dominance and your enemies don't have nukes, that gives you a pretty free hand. Right, as we've seen, Israel has used after the fall of Assad to basically say, okay, we are going to destroy a bunch of your military capabilities that we just don't want you to have, and like there's nothing you can do about it. Sorry,
Right, and Syria has essentially accepted it, right? Like they'll
because what are we going
protest,
to
but
do?
there is no military real response to that because again, it could get so much worse for them.
Yes, and I think in Israel's case, again, whether you think this is accurate or not, this is very much their perception, is the perception of precarity. Like you say, they are a very small country. They've been in a lot of wars with their much larger neighbors. They have the fear, right, that if Iran gets the bomb, they might just use it, right? They might, right? Like that's the fear that I think a lot of Israelis have. That if we allow one of these states to get the bomb, they'll figure out a way to blow up Tel Aviv, right? They'll figure out a way to turn our tiny little country into rubble, and like, yeah, maybe afterwards we'll drop the temple on their heads. But like, we'll also be dead at that point, so maybe we don't want to even contemplate that possibility.
And yeah, and the fact now that it's clear that Iran can get ballistic missiles to hit the ground in Israel, right? what can they accomplish with that conventionally is
Nothing.
unclear, right? It did not seem like they could really stop Israel's aerial bombardment, that they couldn't really make a strategic difference. But they could take, they could blow up a block, they could blow up the oil refinery or whatever from Iran. I think that definitely increases now Israel's perception that the that the bomb is, Iran cannot have it. Unfortunately, I would say Iran's perception that they absolutely need a bomb is probably also strengthened at this point, because the distance between themselves and Israel, their own conventional military, none of those things, right, prevented them from losing a probably a sizable amount of military capacity. Certainly, a lot of top officers, a lot of air defense capacity, and it's not really clear what else on the ground was destroyed in these 12 days.
I think that's right. Iran spent a long time building up a pretty substantial long-range rocket and cruise missile inventory, and it doesn't seem to have done them very much good. Right, that Israel's air defense is very capable. A few get through, but they don't really have the precision to do much. Right, Iran was saying, "Oh, we struck the headquarters of Mossad," and you look at the battle damage assessment, and it's like, "Well, you struck a sewage treatment plant, an empty field, and like a house that are like, within a kilometer of the headquarters of Mossad." But, that's at the level of cost that these kind of ballistic missiles have. That lack of precision with a conventional warhead means they're basically useless. But
and
if there's a
and given
nuclear
the
weapon,
given the distance and the fact they're using ballistic missiles, it's not realistic that you're going to improve much on that, right? This is an you're I mean you're throwing these things an enormous distance, at an extremely high speed. Getting within a kilometer is a technological marvel, right? The idea that you're going to get a much better outcome with a conventional warhead is far far harder than simply putting a bigger warhead on, which in fact might be the same size warhead but with a much larger yield. And that is, that has been the theory behind nuclear armed ballistic missiles. Is it makes the idea of a ballistic missile much more effective, because you're not probably going to hit anything from that distance, except for almost by chance.
yeah, so I think this explains a lot of the strategic logic of why Israel is launching these attacks, why Iran is pursuing the bomb, despite it clearly attracting an enormous amount of ire from the international community, an enormous amount of sanctions, right? Just direct conventional attacks. There's been a lot of work done to deter them from getting the bomb. But the strategic logic they want is like they want to be able to have red lines, right? Where that line is, social construction, perception of threat, you need to tell a story, but like they'd like to have some. And at the moment, they don't have any red lines that Israel is bound to respect.
And of course,
And
yeah, and of course, they see the immediate contrast, between say North Korea and Iraq, right? You have the red line,
mhm,
then you are basically untouchable, right? We may rail on North Korea, but the effectively they're much more secure than Hussein's Iraq, which also had an enormous conventional military at one point. Seemed quite secure from that perspective. In the end, was pretty decimated by the U.S. when the U.S. decided to do
and I want to be clear here. I'm not endorsing Iran getting the bomb, right? I think it would actually be pretty bad if Iran got the bomb, but I do want to recognize that there's a logic to why they're pursuing it. And as I think you've written about for us here at Liberal Currents, this same logic seems to be driving a lot of other nations into thinking about the bomb. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about the context, well beyond Israel and Iran, and the possibility of a new nuclear age.
Yeah, I think it's yeah. What I wrote, I focused on just the two scenarios, right? India, Pakistan, Russia, Ukraine, and how they went quite differently. India, Pakistan was, I don't know, a couple weeks, of controlled escalation, and ultimately a ceasefire. In the end, there was nothing huge that India could gain, even if they had fully committed their military, um, because they were always at risk of this nuclear strike, right? Compared to Ukraine and Russia, we're going on over 3 years now, right? Of a slow escalation, but we've had a full scale war, right? And and although Ukraine has frustrated Russia's military in what it expected to do, they have no way to end it. They have no way to force an end to the conflict. And I think that's going to be immensely instructive for countries around the world. That
Right.
realizing the difference there, and realizing that there is nothing that is going to stop Russia. There is no international, there's Europe and the U.S. and Japan. There's no international even uh, consensus that this needs to be stopped. Right? That maybe we stop trading with Russia while they're doing this. Most countries in the world have not made that cannot come to that conclusion. Right?
Hmm.
Maybe we stop, inviting them to our conferences. Nope, that hasn't happened either. So we're seeing that the things that were supposed to make these wars of conquest more or less unthinkable in the modern age, they aren't there. Uh, on the other hand, nuclear weapons, they still seem to serve that function pretty well. At least if they're backed up by a pretty substantial conventional capacity, which of course Pakistan has. And so you look at countries like Poland. Poland doesn't have even nuclear power plants. They're not going to develop their own weapon, but they're negotiating with France to try to be in this nuclear umbrella that France has, for fear that the U.S. promises are not going to be worth much, right? Um, but the technology is really extremely well developed.
Yeah,
Tons
right.
of
This
countries
is
have the theoretical capacity to do it. Um, but probably dozens of countries have the nuclear power plants that a similar one could be built that could create the fuel, right? It's just it's not 1950 anymore, and try as we might, technology has a way of diffusing, and so the technological barriers that existed to nuclear weapons aren't there, and it really looks like some of the geopolitical barriers are starting to come down, or at least the incentives that might overwhelm those geopolitical barriers are getting much stronger.
Yeah, and I think a really important piece of context in the case of Ukraine is, I believe it was called the Minsk Agreement.
Right.
Um,
Uh,
yeah, can you?
Budapest. Wait, in 1995 was Budapest.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
2014.
I can't remember the yes, the Budapest Agreement. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So at the fall of the Soviet Union, its dissolution into different parts, multiple countries had nuclear weapons on their territory. Right. They belonged to the Soviet Union, and Russia is sort of legally the successor state. So Russia believes like let's bring these weapons back, but their capacity to do that, like in the chaos of post-Soviet politics, was not going to be unilateral. So they signed different agreements with Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. The Ukraine one, the Budapest Memorandum, which is sort of an attachment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is signed by the President of Russia, the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Basically says Ukraine is going to, hand over these weapons that aren't really theirs but are in their territory. They're going to physically move them into Russia. Possession is 9/10 of the law, right? Physically move them to Russia, where they won't be part of a potential Ukrainian nuclear arsenal that they may try to build. Uh, and in exchange, all of these states, the U.S. and Russia and the U.K., agree that Ukraine will remain with its territorial integrity. At this point, Crimea has voted to join Ukraine. And so Ukraine's integrity includes Crimea. That's always been a bit more controversial because it wasn't always part of the Ukrainian SSR, but it has been since the 50s. So this is the agreement in the 90s. Added to that agreement, not part of the agreement itself, which mostly covered the nuclear weapons, but the U.S. and Ukrainian policy really was strategic disarmament. Ukraine scraps, chops up into bits their strategic bombers. Right? They decreased their military capacity dramatically. Ukraine had been one of the certainly the kind of second SSR, right? The second largest of the Soviet republics, and just given the way the industrial or the Russian Empire industrialized, Ukraine was, not at parity with Russia, but a major portion of Russia's industry, especially militarily. Ukraine really scales a lot of that back because on paper they have these guarantees, right? Not just the, I mean, in theory, every country has the UN Charter,
Hmm.
but they have these additional guarantees specifically from Russia, saying your territorial integrity and your sovereignty are secure. You can disarm.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this gets back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like credibility and having a coherent story. And the story works as long as people believe it, right? That you say, okay, yeah, disarm, right? You have a lot of nuclear weapons, a lot of them were just built there, right? But give them up and it'll be fine. You have our promise, you have our word that your territorial integrity will remain intact. And they believed us, right? And for good reason. We are very clearly now, like, especially, after the seizure of Crimea, which we let go without a whisper. I mean, maybe a
A
whisper,
whisper
but
about that.
we let go with a whisper, right? The continuing, like, again, basically salami tactics in the east of Ukraine, now the full scale invasion, and we've kind of let it all slide. Say, like, yeah, war of conquest, you can do
Right,
it now. Right? You were not in NATO proper. Like, yeah, we gave you this agreement, but like that agreement doesn't count anymore,
right,
right? And this is like an acid eating away at all other promises, at all other guarantees, right? South Korea is looking at the world and saying, well, we're not in NATO, right? Like, yeah, for a long time, we had an assurance that wasn't written down, but we believed it, and everybody believed it, that the American Red Line ran right along the southern edge of the DMZ.
right. And,
Today,
and and South Korea especially, right? South Korea's technology is such that they help other countries build nuclear power plants, right? They're extremely
if
um,
South Korea wants the bomb, they will get the bomb.
right. There's yes, technologically there's no barrier there, right? There's a time barrier, but it's probably not a ton of time either. So South Korea non-proliferation in South Korea is entirely a matter of diplomacy and public opinion, right? And there's probably several other countries that are not far behind, where uh, if this, you know, if they feel like these guarantees are no longer valid, um, and above and beyond the Budapest Memorandum, we have a president who is really, consistent on inconsistency, right? It really insists that agreements with the U.S. are not really valid, right? That they're valid to the extent that the president believes them to be, and no further. Um, that creates a very potentially dangerous picture, where you know, and that all goes back down to really the assumption was we could differentiate between peaceful nuclear use and military nuclear use, and so peaceful nuclear use is all over the world, right? Probably every continent. Uh, but the technology for military nuclear use is now much harder to control, much harder to silo off and say like, but you can't get. I mean, the technology to build a bomb is extremely easy to get. The technology to get the fuel for it, the fissile material, is harder, but not nearly as hard as it was in the 50s.
Yes. Yeah, and then I mean, there's the bomb, there's delivery system, right? Putting together a long range ballistic missile isn't the easiest thing in the world. Right? A lot of them took North Korea a while to get there to build a missile that would actually like go somewhere instead of just exploding on the launch pad. But they got there, right? All of these technologies at this point are 50 years old,
Right,
right?
and the ballistic missile technology. I mean, that's maybe the another big takeaway from Iran Israel. It's there and it's expensive, but it's not prohibitively so. Right, Iran is not a poor country, but it's not a terribly wealthy country. And they were able to launch a very large number of ballistic missiles.
Yeah, so right on a technical level, on a scientific industrial level, the barriers to nuclear weapons, to nuclear missiles aren't really there anymore. What kept them in check was this system of assurance, right? This understanding, not something, not the words on the paper, but the belief and the perception that those words meant something, right? And as various actors have made choices that undermine that credibility, suddenly we are in a completely different world where something that would have been taboo, right? South Korean defense officials speculating, maybe we should go for the bomb, right? At one point, that would have been an immense taboo to cross, and now people hear that and they're like, yeah, that's right.
Probably makes sense.
Right, and they're hardly the only ones. Poland, like you say, they don't have a domestic nuclear industry. They could have one if they wanted to, right?
Sure.
And they might not even need to, right? They might just be able to get warheads from other people, invest in their own delivery systems, right? Japan obviously has a very different history here, but if the American promise isn't worth very much, then they might start thinking about other possibilities, right? Taiwan might start thinking about other possibilities. There are a lot of countries around the world who have very large neighbors, very with designs on their territory. And what's kept all of those tensions in check has been the system of alliances and promises and security that we built up over decades and now is starting to fray.
So what I'm hearing is our narrative coherence is more important than ever. Having a clear story that we're telling where our red lines are scarcely used so that they maintain
Mhm.
credibility, but where we back up the things that we've said. And unfortunately, I would say narrative coherence is not currently one of the strengths of the American executive.
That's
And
right.
this likely continues to deteriorate unless we see a major shift in terms of the message that the U.S. is sending to the world about what it means about nonproliferation, what it means about its mutual defense agreements, uh, and can give a coherent story about how we're going to behave in a given situation.
I think that's right. And I think, unfortunately, this is something that's going to take longer than a single presidential administration to fix, right? Because fundamentally, what underpinned the Cold War assurances was that parties changed, presidents came and went, but the foreign policy was relatively consistent. The red lines were consistent. The commitment to NATO was ironclad. And sure, the next president might say, yes, NATO, we're back in it. But as long as there's the fear in 4 years, who's going to be sitting in that chair? Are they going to have that same commitment? Until we as a country, right, not just as an occupant of the Oval Office, but as a country and as both political parties come to a new consensus about foreign policy and foreign affairs, it's going to be very hard to rebuild the world that was.
And I wish I had a more positive note to put in there, but I don't. As the world exists, I'm not sure we have one. Right, that is where we are. It's a world we need to start adjusting to. And yeah, if the process of building narrative coherence is going to happen, it is going to take some time, and the world is going to be quite different by the time that credibility is restored.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's the note I kind of want to end on here is that there's a lot of people who fundamentally, I believe, want to stick their heads in the sand, right? They want to say, this is all just warmongering. This is all just fear mongering. This is all just one president. And if he just goes away, everything will go back to normal. Everything will go back to the way it was. And I don't think that's true. I think we are entering a new era of national competition and a new era of geopolitical uncertainty. I think that in many ways, the pressures pushing us in that direction predate Trump, right? This new era of great power competition, right? Russia gets a say too. China gets a say too in whether we are, in fact, in competition. And I think at this point, it's clear what their position is. And right, like it or not, that's the world we are living in. And as liberals, we need to start thinking a lot harder about what it means to live in that world and what it means to have a successful foreign policy in this new era of uncertainty, of competition, and of conflict. Um, so, yeah, Matthew, thank you so much for coming on and talking some of these issues over with us. It's been instructive, if a bit depressing.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thanks so much, and we'll leave our listeners with a bit of a downer, but maybe inspire some new efforts. Let's hope for it.
Let's hope for it.
All right.
See you around.